Dave had a chance to interview Michael Tsarion, who's definitely one of my favorite members of the so-called conspiracy community. He's an author and lecturer with works such as Origins and Oracles, The Irish Origins of Civilization, Atlantis, Alien Visitation and Genetic Manipulation, and the Terrascope series. He's an expert on occult knowledge, history, numerology, astrology, and the control hierarchy that a lot of us are being influenced by on a daily basis. You can go to michaeltsarion.com. That's Michael, Tsarion.com, to learn more and to check out his works and various websites. I personally find Architects of Control to be an extremely eye-opening DVD, along with his 9-hour lecture series, Age of Manipulation. Check those out if you have any interest in waking up to the bullshit in your life. Now let's get to it. Michael Tsarion. Alright, I'm honored to have you here. You're one of my favorite alternative researchers, for lack of a better term, I guess. And I'll, of course, provide a preface and an introduction for you when this episode goes online, but I'd rather just skip the formalities and jump into some of the questions, because I already know the material is very diverse and involved, and we're just going to scratch the surface. So, I mean, is that all right with you?
Let's go. Yeah, that's great. Sure. I have no problem with that.
Well, a lot of your work is on symbolism and the meaning behind certain events, and I wanted to hear your perspective on two of the biggest events recently, being the royal wedding and the apparent death of bin Laden, and ask if you see any significance in them, symbolically.
Well, yeah, there's not just that, but there's a lot of other things going on. I mean, one has to say, before you even start speaking in a conspiratorial angle, just from almost a layman's point of view, these kinds of fiascos are there just to, again, either edify people, keep them distracted, or to traumatize them. So we have a, sort of a good cop, bad cop, hot cold situation going, in which they know that now that they've reduced the human race to the absolute lowest common denominator of intellect, that then you're just on this sort of slaveocracy level, in which everything that comes, a good portion of people's reality, so to speak, is a hyper reality, a fantasy reality, a pseudo reality. Just in the same way that young kids would play with soldiers, and we grow up playing games. Once you've been reduced to the infantile level, you're still in that fantasy realm, even if you may be 40 years of age or whatever it might be. So, royal weddings, wars, dramas, it's all just a theater. The world is just a theater in which you have your guys with the black caps and the guys with the white caps, and there's this whole, so much of our world anyway today, so much of what we see isn't perceived in reality, is perceived through some digital medium. Obviously, what I mean there is the television and the cinema and the news and all the rest of it. So a lot of these things are just played out on the most basic level, is just simply bread and circuses for the masses. Yeah, that's on the most basic level. Then what you're hinting at, though, is the more subtle levels, where there may be some ritualistic elements that are much more esoteric and much more deep. And of course, I do track that. It's a full-time job, and no doubt about it that any time that the spring equinox comes up, you're going to have major rituals. There's no surprise that this last attack on Libya was again at the Feast of Purim in March, that it was time for the crossing over point of the spring equinox, and the date that usually describes the spring equinox is, March 22nd, which is 322, which is the famous lodge number of the Skull and Bone Society. So that's just one reason. The most important one is the actual physical rising of the sun over the equinox. It's an enormously important time. That's also why in America, you guys are from the States, that tax time is around that period. Why? Why would tax time, what are taxes? That's the slave producing his wages. Why is it handed over at that time? That's because the stars of Libra are in the sky at that time, and the sign of Libra is related to the scales, which tax people used to come around to door in the old days, even right up to the medieval time. Their logo or their emblem over their doors, and also they would physically carry one around, was a big scales, a large scales. You'll even hear about this in the Bible with Matthew, the tax collector. And the symbol of the tax collectors from that time immemorial has been this large scales, you know, when you used to balance rice and beans and gold and all that. And it just turns out that the stars of the scales, that's Libra, is in the sky very prominently around about this time of the year. And that's one of the reasons why the collectors, so to speak, you know, the IRS or whatever, come out to do that. So it's just a welter of symbolism that they're using both in their corporate logos and their timing of things. And you're speaking now about two very specific events that, I even heard that the so-called, you know, assassination of bin Laden there is almost on the same day as the birth of Adolf Hitler. It's very close to the time of the World Illuminati Celebration Day, May 15th, you know. And then most importantly, there's a couple of other important astrological things that one needs to know about this time, and that's why the royal wedding is been timed now. One small anecdote about the royals is that the Queen of England, whose birthday is actually in May, always traditionally has celebrated it in the sign of Gemini. So she's a Taurus, but she celebrates her birthday in Gemini. You'll find this kind of displacement quite a lot. There was Prince Charles did it also, but I can't remember the incident in which he did it, where a certain festival or celebration, this was close to the time of Lady Spencer's killing, some sort of celebration was marked for October, but it didn't actually happen until later than that. And sometimes they do this because, again, they're very conscious of lunar time and sidereal time. But the two events I was going to speak about that happen in May is that the Milky Way begins there. In stellar astrology, the Milky Way begins between the signs of Taurus and Gemini and run all the way across the zodiac to Sagittarius and Scorpio, just like a sort of a large bridge or a river. And in fact, in ancient days, the Milky Way was referred to as the river Styx, as the river of the Pharaoh, or the sacred river. And therefore, that is running very close to this period right now. And a lot of the world's traditions, including the Maya, Aztec, Egyptian, Celtic, you name it, have been precisely arranged for this particular time. Very important celebrations, I might add. And then, for instance, this particular, what they call colure, or cusp, as it's now referred to, between the signs of Gemini and Taurus is important because that's where we get the word Minotaur. In the whole Grecian myth of the hero going into the underworld to face the so-called Minotaur, it's actually a play on words. Mini being Gemini, right, the end of Gemini, and Taur being the beginning of the word Taurus. So Minotaur facing the Minotaur. This is how these myths and legends, fairy tales, folk tales are created as veneer for astrotheological stories, traditions that are only known to the initiates. The people who create the movies know this. They're still doing the same thing. That's why half the movie companies of the world have this stellar symbolism on their graphics at the very beginning, be it TriStar or Disney or I don't care what. Right. They're all aware of this stuff, you see. So that's another important portal point that happens in Taurus. And so a lot of these things will be coordinated for this. But then the third, and I think the most important thing to realize about rituals that happen in May, is that just as I said that during tax time the stars of Libra are prominent, well, in the period of Taurus and Gemini where we are now, it's the stars of the 13th sign of the zodiac, Ophiuchus. It's actually on the other side of the zodiac, but at night its constellations are in the sky. So right now why things are very important is because that 13th sign, under which so much ritual is done from this point of view, if you're talking about the Secret Brotherhood, the Black Lodge, the Illuminati. Therefore, they're going to always target very important relationships, very important ceremonies at this time because of the presence in the sky of Ophiuchus, the 13th sign. And that's an entire study in itself. So that's one thing to be looking into, is the presence of the 13th sign that's happening right now.
Are we just carrying on an old tradition with these things, or is there an astrological draw, or is this just part of the control scheme?
It's a mixture of all. They do this in exactly the same way as you would look at a wristwatch. It's that automatic. It's that unconscious in some sense. Of course, the planning is conscious and what have you, but what I'm talking about is the ideology, the idea that you should use the cosmological symbolism to protect you, to work with. I mean, you know, I've gone blue in the face talking about to my members of Time Gnosis that they all, you know, who are members of that system, using even the most basic numerology for their day-to-day business affairs and so on. And people get back to me saying, you know, they see incredible, they're actually almost speechless with the amount of empowerment that they get from that kind of system. Well, that's just, you know, that's just a module we've created. That's a very simplistic but, you know, brilliant system. Think about if you had centuries of knowledge that you could draw upon, that your advisors, you know, high-grade astronomers and astrologers, people who knew so much intimate details about symbolism, about numerology, about divination and so on, and alchemy and what have you. So obviously when they have this great power, they want to use it. They are very clever in that sense, and that's why they maintain the power that they have, because really they're not able to maintain it in other ways. If we look at history, we'll see that they've had great setbacks as well. They've not only had great infighting, these royals and these dynasties, but, you know, times have changed. Like if you examine what happened in the aftermath of the First and Second World War, the rise of the labor parties, the rise of the common man to be educated and so on, they've had major setbacks. They've had to make a lot of concessions. And they've had to scale back their overt power. What I'm saying is that the way that they used to maintain power by way of the whip, and by some baron sitting on in his mansion with, you know, an army of slaves. I mean, those days are over, you know what I mean? Mm-hmm. They couldn't maintain that anymore. So they had to scale that back somewhat. But these are very cunning people who know that ultimately, even though you may have to scale that back, or you may have to downsize or whatever, doesn't mean you necessarily have to go out of business. You just become more cunning at it, mm-hmm. and more structured at it. And we know this is an absolute fact, because we see the same thing happening in the Balkans now. After the fall of communism, exactly what I'm saying took place, where you have in the Balkans, after the communists, you had many of the aristocratic, oligarchical families of the old days, you know, the old Austro-Hungarian Empire and all of these people who've been living in London since the rise of communism. Their daughters and sons, very aristocratic people, have gone back to, you know, Yugoslavia, Romania, Bulgaria to set up shop. Even some of them have moved back into ancestral homes. That's the palaces that are still there, albeit dilapidated. And what's the very first thing that happens? Is that all the local yokels, right, who used to be slaves, their fathers used to be slaves under these oligarchs, are now laying out red carpets and tipping their caps to these Slavic oligarchs, just so glad to have them back now that the rotten communists have disappeared. Welcome, Your Highness. And we'll be glad to bend our backs and pick your potatoes and do your grapes for you, you know, and create your vineyards. Like nothing has ever happened. They're actually begging for oligarchy to come back. So let's not forget that that's exactly the same paradigm as in the West. If these Western oligarchs, pompous bastards that they are, if they could get away with an army of Irish laborers and slave labor, they'd still be doing it. You know, take my word for it. It's just that they weren't able to get that, so they have to then use other means to secure their power. And one of those is the use of this incredible archive of symbolism to befuddle, to mind control, to create situations in which people start auto-hypnotizing themselves. Astrology is part of it, of course, and that's why you will have the flag-waving yokel, you know, Joe Schmoes coming out, waving their flags, you know, still to this day, or even worse, donning uniforms to go out and be murdered and to murder in the name of these oligarchs or the institutions that these oligarchies control. My work exposes what these institutions are. People can go to my forum. They can contact me to find out the network of royal orgs. You know, I have on my forum a page there called Empire of Death. People only need to go to that and start reading that, meticulously study the links that I've put up there, and they will find just how vast this oligarchical network is, even though it may be somewhat in the background, hiding behind charities, institutions like medical and educational and philanthropic. It's the same story you have in America with the Council on Foreign Relations, the Trilateral Commission, you know, the Rand Institute, the Brookings Institute. All of these orgs are royal. They're offshoots of the Royal Institute of International Affairs and the Mount Carolyn Society and so on and so forth, or the Club of the Isles and all of these alpha lodges of Freemasonry. And they've been slowly moving into the American milieu. They carry the symbolism that's almost identical to that which is used by the oligarchs of England. And they did that through your American Constitution and through the Founding Fathers, who were nothing less than British agents for the most part.
Most of the founding fathers were Freemasons, correct?
Yeah.
Almost all of them. And people have to realize that when they say that, they've got to understand that saying Freemason doesn't really tell you that much. Some of these people were not only Freemasons, but very high degree Freemasons. That's the point. Mm-hmm. They were not just your common, like your dad or my dad going down to the lodge, that kind of thing, having a few drinks and all that.
It's a whole different world.
Oh, yes. It's a totally different world. So always have to add that point that, number one, I'm not indicting normal Freemasons in any sense, nor am I indicating that these people are of your normal, traditional Freemasonic type, that the local, pub owner or the local, governor, or even to that extent, police chief or whatever. It's far, far higher than that. These people come from dynastic families, Livingstone, Menzies. Oh my God, the list goes on of these families, the Sinclairs and the Kellogg's and whatever. There's so many families, the bloodline families, really.
I'm pretty vested in your work, and I had Dave watch Architects of Control just recently, and we also watched a little bit of Age of Manipulation, which is, I believe, a 9-hour series.
Something like that, yeah.
It's great, but considering that this information is kind of new to a large part of my audience, can you sort of broadly talk to us about the history of the control and some of the major lies we've been told, including our origins? And I also was always curious as what is really the point outside of, I guess, control to hide that information from us? Because you could tell us a real history in some ways and really just with an economic model still enslave us.
Well, slavery is what you are talking about is slavery. Right. But slavery is ultimately a model that doesn't work unless you have hierarchy. So when you start studying one thing, like say slavery, look at, just my 9-to-5 job, how I'm locked in there, or I hate my boss, or look at who I am in this university, I've tried my best, but all these guys above me. Whatever way the little man starts to already start asking questions that lead one thing to another. It's like I've always described it as pulling a little thread, then the thread becomes a string, the string becomes a rope, the rope becomes a chain, and the next thing you know, you got a big, whale in your living room. Mm-hmm. So these things, one leads to the other, and then you start studying slavery, or debt slavery, or what have you, and then you start moving up to say, who are these corporations, and then you go beyond, and you start finding out about these secret societies that are all over the world, and these chivalric orders, and their antiquity, and then somebody like me would say, oh, wait a minute, as you said from the beginning, the symbolism tells you, well, that's kind of crazy, because there's a lot of Egyptian symbolism, it's a lot of what appears to be Jewish symbolism. Oh, why is that? How does that work? And one thing keeps leading to the other. And then you start finding out it goes deeper and deeper, all the way back through Babylon, the monetary system, back through Rome, the symbolism, all of this goes all the way back to Egypt. And you start tracking all of this. And the moment that you're getting wiser and wiser, and the moment you're getting smarter and smarter on this, or let's just use the symbolism I use a lot of the mountain, you're getting higher and higher, there's a dark side. And that is you're getting further and further away from the people that you grew up with.
Right.
Intellectually. Right? So, just as you're about to turn around and go, hey guys, here, I can give you a handle on what's going on here, and this can be in even a quite small way, nobody wants to hear. So then that apathy starts taking you yet in another direction, and what I mean by that, of course, is then you're into the study of psychology. Because now you have to say that there's a relationship between the slave and the master. It's not just a straight situation of control. I'm speaking like this because you jogged my memory about the Architects of Control DVD, where we went into this more than at other times, in which we started to try and point out that this is a slave-master relationship. And that can't be understood at all until you understand what it is in the mind of the slave that wants to have the master, wants to obey authority. This takes you into then a lot of what to me is more fascinating information, because as you well know, most of the people in the conspiracy or the people who are into revisionism will put the focus mostly on that overt control. And they're implying by that the slave actually would love to be free. See, I've never believed this. I actually believe that it's a relationship, just in the same way that you can hear them say it. I mean, you listen to Aldous Huxley and people like that, they'd be glad to tell you this. That man has been a slave, and he's an instrument in his own enslavement. What has happened down through the centuries is that the slave has just exchanged chains of iron for chains of gold, metaphorically speaking. If he can have a bit less punitive treatment, he'll be okay with that. He doesn't really want to leave the walls of the prison.
Right.
So a person like me is standing there saying, but the gates can be opened, wide open, and you can all leave. And they're all sitting there going, no, you leave. We're happy here. So then what happens is this road then takes you into a study of psychology and the dynamics of consciousness and what have you. And then you start putting your finger on the very nexus of it, the very nub of this whole problem that you then see played out in society or played out in politics, whereas that it's a relationship between the slave and the master, and you understand then the brilliance of the controller, the big brother, so to speak, as that term has been used, because they're aware of this. As you start getting really clever with this, because you realize that the slave doesn't want to really be free, and that if he gives up one set of chains, he just buys into another one. Then you start to understand that it's the slave master who has understood this. This is part of the occult knowledge that they use. So one angle of this could take you into studying ancient history as a historian, but another direction can take you into studying philosophy or say even psychology, and keep it contemporary, keep it, contemporary to what's happening now. Yeah, now, I mean, obviously you need to do both as much as possible, but for me the more intriguing aspect is the psychology, because then you're kind of understanding, you're seeing through their eyes, you're seeing through the eyes of the master. If the master can create a situation in which his slave is auto-hypnotized, my God, then the game is up, because the slave is doing his own hypnotizing. He's completely on remote control, as we spoke about in the DVD. And then when you're now going to move on to talk about remedies to these problems, a person like myself who's made a study of this is no longer really convinced that political change is really going to work. We don't rule it out, but we're certainly not as optimistic about that kind of change. We understand now that the change has to take on an individual psychological level. That's where the Gordian knot is. As I said, a lot of this master-slave relationship stuff can be found even on a day-to-day basis, in the place of work or even in the home, certainly in the relationship of parents to children and teachers and society to the young and all the rest of it, and then ultimately internally, the relationship that we have with our own selves internally. So, and what I mean by that is, it's a strange quirk of human nature that as soon as you're born, you have two enemies, so to speak, two adversaries. One is the outer world of all of its, quandaries and tribulations and stimuli. You have to defend against that. You've got to negotiate all of that, all the ups and downs and shenanigans of the external world in order to stay sane and to be able to function. But we're also, as human beings, have this internal world, what apparently is the subjective world, to deal with, our own complexes, our own syndromes. So human beings stand on the sort of twilight zone between an external world that's threatening and impenetrable, so to speak, and you have this internal world. And the masters at the top of the ladder know all about this. And one of the methodologies that then they use to keep people in a state of total lockdown is this trauma and the constant fear and the constant anxiety, knowing full well that if you create a lot of external tribulation of whatever kind it may be, hidden and more obvious, that will have a psychological consequence in which the person themselves is just literally drowning, in anxiety. And it's through this fear equals anxiety dynamic that the greatest control operates, really.
Yeah, when you mention the trauma, it makes me think about it, seen in your work and other work as well from Jordan Maxwell or David Icke. A lot of this is ancient trauma that comes from the origins of our species, which it's interesting that all ancient texts talk about gods coming from the sky, and to me I can completely see that being extraterrestrials and not gods. There's in translation that would be hard to differentiate between the two. And,
it is.
Also, it's interesting that we're the only being I know of that has two chromosomes fused into one slot, and I don't see that anywhere in nature.
Exactly. There's so many bizarrities about the human being. I've written about these in the Atlantis book, gone into great detail on this. Mm-hmm. And again, I would say that even if you just start from a non-conspiratorial point of view, which means if you can't buy into the idea of alien invasion or whatever, just the very fact of earth changes, just the very fact of cataclysm in a physical sense. There are many authors who've written about this who haven't the faintest idea about conspiracy, and yet they still conclude that the mind was traumatized. One of those people is Julian James. The great scientist. So, and he's not the only one. So there's people from within the traditional world who have accepted that psychologically man suffered a major trauma. There's actually a whole school of these people. I refer to them in my DVD and book. Their names are right there for people to follow that up, who have actually concluded that man is a traumatized being. They all have sort of different takes on what caused the trauma, but they somewhat agree that some sort of earth changes, whether it was desertification, the lack of rain, or it might have been volcanoes, or it might have been, the biblical flood. Some of them even do believe in that through the work of Immanuel Velikovsky and others, and Commons Beaumont and others, they do recognize that the world was, rent by enormous disasters. So even if you don't buy into an extraterrestrial presence, it still is factual enough to say that the earth itself, through plague, through famine, through cataclysm, through tidal waves and tsunamis and even a pole shift, all of this is now coming to light in very recent times. That alone will convince an open-minded person that something enormous took place to the psyche of man. In my opinion, there's no doubt about it. There can't be any doubt about it. And it is good to see that now David, for one, has been talking about that. His latest work is looking into the cataclysm somewhat. Mm-hmm. And that's great, because I insist that it needs to be studied. It's the center of my work, and it's very important to understand that particular original biological, physiological and both psychological trauma aided and abetted the masters later on. They know about it. They know that the psyche is fragmented. They probably know a great deal about it. And they have said, well, listen, that happened fortunately, so all we got to do is sort of maintain a constant culture of trauma in order to bring in whatever agenda they're doing. They bring it in on the back of that, of wars, of famines, of poverty, of tremendous social injustice, and then the psychological versions of disorders that are rampant all over the world. If the mind is already schizoid in its very origin, if what we have as today's consciousness is schizoid in its origin, then it's very simple to create yet further forms of, schizophrenia in human beings. And then since human beings, through their life force, through their energy, create the societies that go on to then create the sociological setting, obviously those societies will then be schizogenic. And then it becomes a feedback loop. The schizogenic societies create yet further children who are polarized, fragmented, narrow, spiritless, whatever you want to call it, and then they go on to create yet more. So that's why we're heading towards this post-human world. That's in a long time in the making. And it doesn't happen just through one thread. It's very deeply disturbed people, to the point where now they're even wanting to shut down emotion. People are not in any way attuned to their own emotions, for goodness sake. And then that brings up a huge big pharma leviathan to take care of that again, because what man will do, and what man has been traditionally doing, and one thing we must insist is that you're going to see more of this as we count down to 2012 and beyond. What I'm going to say now is going to be increasing as the years go by, but it has been happening in the past all down through the ages, is that when a human being has that inner anxiety I was talking about, where they have to confront all the inner syndromes and complexes, one of the methodologies that the ego uses to offset responsibility or to just escape that inner trauma is to project it outwards, is to simply say that the reason for all their disorderly feelings or this feeling of anxiety or stress or whatever it might be, it's externally, it's because of this and that and the other. It's because of the economy. It's because of the wars. It's because of, relationships or whatever. Man will always find ways to project his inner angst onto the external world, place the blame there, and then step back, and then again want some authority figure to come in and lead them or guide them or fix it. So we have this problem as well, is what's called the transference, the displacement, or the sublimation. And people not taking personal responsibility for their consciousness or their lives, and then happily, in some sense of the word, projecting it outwards, and then either going to some high priest in the sense of even religion, or the high priests of psychology or psychiatry. Well, that's another master-slave relationship. This is the dynamic that happens when people have lost so much of their own power.
Everyone's looking for an expert.
Yes, and that's all right to a degree. Naturally, there are experts who are smarter than us, and it's good to find out what they have to say, but not to the extent where you've given up completely the reins of your own thinking, your own biology, and even to a certain extent your own bioenergetics. Your own bioenergetic energy is no longer under your own control. Somebody else rules almost every aspect of your life. in the same way that a dominating parent controls every single aspect of the child's life, to the extent where the child becomes neurotic. Because if a parent, let's just use this metaphor of the parents, the child is already put into a state of neurosis because it's scared that if it does a bad deed, it will lose the love of its parents. I mean, this is just psychology 101, right? Mm-hmm. So child fears, oh, yeah, I don't want to do bad things because the parent will get angry, or the parent will get cold, or the parent might reprimand me, and the parent might, even in the most extreme case, lose love. And I'll lose that security, and I'll lose that love of my parent, right, the authority figure. So that's what causes the child to then do good, so to speak. And many psychologists have argued, is the child really doing good out of its own true, actual moral, nature, or is it because it knows it's going to get punished? But that's a separate thing we don't need to go into. All we need to look at is that there is this feeling. And then the child's acts of badness, what would constitute one of those acts of badness? Rebellion, outright aggression. If the child is already worried about a mere infraction bringing the disapproval of the parent, the child is fully aware that if it acts completely aggressively or stands up against the parent for even the parent's misdemeanors, it will suffer an incredible wave of retaliation, right? So what then happens is, in the child's mind, the next level of repression is of the aggressive instincts. And see, what my message is that these aggressive instincts are not all necessarily bad. When something rotten is happening to you, you should act aggressively. You should not be all right with it. But very early on as children, we learn that any act of aggression whatsoever will be immediately cause enormously painful reactions. Like I say, the complete loss of love from a parent, let alone all these other consequences that might happen. So the instinct of aggression, which is a natural bioenergetic response to the violation of your integrity and the violation of your selfhood, you repress it in order to identify with the master, to identify and get their approval. So in other words, you're willing to accept any kind of tyranny and even accept the approval of that tyranny because you've repressed your own instinct of aggression, and that act of aggression might have been as a defense against the violation of your selfhood. So this is what we see when then we take a step forward and move into the political world or into the sociological world. That's what we have. We have a world of smiling depressives, each one of us seeking the approval of others, and it's a soft tyranny that is taking place. And the moment that any individual, and this is the crux of the matter, and people who are going to think deeply about what I'm going to say now, they will have a big, big piece of the answer here. And that is that the anxiety exists when any kind of show of selfhood emerges. So in other words, that the person who has repressed their instincts, the person who has completely self-mutilated their own selfhood, their anxiety is not a true anxiety, right? Their stress is not a true stress. It's the stress of that selfhood which doesn't go away, trying to reemerge healthfully. So the person's own neurosis, the person's own disorders, of which we know the world is awash in, is actually a pseudo-anxiety, a pseudo-despair, a pseudo-distress, because you're actually been repressing your selfhood. And that selfhood, being a natural, organic, spiritual thing, doesn't die. You can repress it, but it doesn't go away. Anytime that it tries to reemerge in whatever form, that now causes your anxiety. So the anxieties of the world today and the stresses of the world today are actually based on their true voice trying to make a reemergence. So it's incredible how this thing works. And therefore, you're actually self-mutilating yourself. It's the self-murder that I talk about incessantly, this self-sadism that's going on. And you do it to get the approval of these slave masters who are pretty much in the same boat. They're the self-murdered. And then they encourage you to self-murder yourself, and then you do it. And then any anxiety that exists today is not, Greg, the anxiety of, oh my God, I wish we were all free. I just wish we could get rid of Big Brother. I'm losing sleep because we're in a slaveocracy. No, the stress is, gee, I wish I could get a better placement in that slaveocracy. Gee, my biggest problem is I wish I could really get rid of my selfhood completely. I wish it wouldn't bother me at all, and I was able to go along and get along and be a real celebrity, and have everything that Big Brother could hand me. I haven't got enough seniority within the lie.
Right.
This is what we're dealing with, and that's why that answers, as I said, if people think about this, it'll answer a lot of things. One thing it answers is why so many people in so many parts of the world deny the conspiracy and fall in line. You see, that's why there's so many treacherous, deceptive people all over the world in the state of delusion, so that when somebody like me starts to speak, they go, Michael, you're crazy. Look at all the sane people with their uniforms on, walking in lockstep. What are you telling us, that we're crazy? You see, that's why it's so ubiquitous throughout the world, because it's an inner psychological contract that people have with themselves. And so you have to free yourself, first of all, from that web of lies. You have to ask yourself, not that I've been sold a lie, but why have I bought a lie?
Hell yeah.
I mean, I find that all the time. The more I talk about this type of material, be it even the control side of it, or even the Nephilim side of it, even the Anunnaki side of all that ancient stuff, or be it Atlantis or UFOs or anything, I'm constantly seeing myself marginalized by people I've known for 15 years that just they don't have an interest, and I'm like, I can't see how they don't have an interest. It's kind of it's fun. It's like they'd rather continue to play the game and try to get ahead in it, like you said, than admit they're playing a game at all. And
but if you brought out your balls to do a juggling act in front of them, you'd have tons of mates.
Exactly. How do we get back to finding our selfhood, as you said?
By never asking anybody else how to do it, and by fully by disconnecting that chain. And first of all, just noticing it simply without judgment. Because if you judge yourself, then you're doing the same self-sadism and beating yourself up. Just observe it, like any genealogist observes whatever he observes. It's basically a sort of a rational observation of the self and how we disempower ourselves. My work is entirely based on that. It's a deconstructive process, or I've described it in other ways, an apophatic learning, in which you simply deconstruct and try to break down the kind of barriers that stand in the way of your selfhood. Ultimately, all thinking is destructive. I know people have a very difficult time understanding this, but thinking is deconstructive. The rational, critical apparatus is to break down illusion, to see through lies. Scientists do it every day. Detectives do it every day. We do it every day. Progress is all about looking at how to do a thing better, which means throwing out all redundant ways of doing things. That's what psychoanalysis, psychology, philosophy is all about. And one of those threads is the simple, natural response that we have to seek guidance from the misguided. There's many reasons why we do it, but it needs to stop. And we have an entire world full of gurus and teachers and pseudo-teachers and misleaders and whatever else, who, because they have a little modicum of knowledge or insight, technical or other, they then set themselves up as gods. This was pointed out even by Socrates, 300 years BC, that this is what people do. And then they set themselves up as authorities and then try to dominate everybody else. They don't awaken your own natural intelligence. Shit, that threatens the hell out of them. They don't want that. So we have all these petty dictatorships, starting from the home, starting from the family level on up. And we have to watch that tendency in ourselves, and we have to realize that when it comes specifically to your question, how do we return to selfhood, there is no A to Z anywhere. There may be some signposts that other teachers and philosophers who've done lots of thinking through the centuries, and we definitely should be up to speed on a lot of their theories, of course, because we don't have, one of the other paradoxes here is that the normal human life isn't long enough to even come to grips with some of this information. That unfortunately is just a built-in problem. One of the things that assists us is the fact that we have, many teachers, many philosophers and great men who have done a lot of this thinking for us and have sort of percolated down a lot of the key answers, and we should be up to speed with what they're talking about, but only as signposts. We still have to walk the map. We can't just get in line behind those guys. They knew what they knew for themselves. Their philosophies was an outcome of their particular psychology as well. Doesn't mean that it's going to fit everything that each other individual understands. So you have to have all these teachings percolate down through your own consciousness, and that means work. That means hard work, and that means cutting no corners. But it doesn't seem like hard work if you're passionate about it. That's what really separates the sheep from the goats. It's only a lot of hard work if a person is so distracted with other nonsense in the sensational world. And it hasn't got the passion. If the person has the passion about it, then it doesn't seem like hard work at all. To familiarize yourself with these concepts, for instance, just explaining why there's the mind-body, dualism or whatever it might be, or again, starting with the symbolism question, or asking the big question, is there a God, and so forth and so on. If a man is passionate about these kinds of questions, then he will be guided, but he doesn't need any external physical guide necessarily. Those are just signposts that he meets on the way as he is doing the walking. This is the thing to bear in mind.
Yeah, I mean, I know you're familiar with Alan Watts, but he basically taught me that Zen is just trying to act without that thinking filter. Just act immediately without overthinking it. And when it comes to the symbolism, that is where I think I just drive myself crazy. And, like, for example, I have a friend, Kyle, who swears by the symbology as well as, like, the 11:11 phenomenon. And for me, it's just a hard thing to believe, but and I actually have been talking to him about, I've personally experienced an overwhelmingly amount of coincidences with the number 42, and I don't understand why or what it could mean, and I drive myself crazy with interpreting some of the symbolism in life, because people, lectures talk about the idea that your higher self is trying to talk to you or lead you, or something's trying to lead you, and I drive myself crazy wondering about the interpretation of symbols, or is there meaning in this, or am I just projecting this meaning onto something, and stuff like that. Like, how can we hone in on what's meaningful?
Well, we do it all the time, but what we do is, like you've just said in your sentence, you beat yourself up for doing it. That natural flow of intelligence that is projecting, and that's a good thing. You're meant to do that. You're meant to see all meaning. When you speak about meaning, there is no meaning external to you at all. All there is existing things. That's where you start. The universe has a bunch of things in it, be it stars or trees or table legs or, God knows what, or even for that matter, other people. Those are what are known as objects of consciousness, right? And they just exist. But they don't actually have any meaning. This is the mistake that we've flipped it over. We have an inverse understanding. Meaning comes only from within. So the person who's able to give meaning to life from within himself, he's living. He's what's known as actualized. He's an actual person. He actually has not only existence, which is given. See, we didn't create our own minds or our bodies, and we didn't create the universe. So in philosophy, for instance, they ask, what can you be certain of? Well, you can be certain of one thing. You didn't create yourself, and you didn't create the universe around you. That's certain, period. So start with that. And if you didn't create those things, then you sitting worrying about what existed before God existed, and how the universe came in before the Big Bang, and what might have been before time, is kind of, in a way, really meaningless from an existential point of view, because you weren't there, you didn't create it, and in your one life you probably could never work it out. And even if you did work it out, say some scientists actually cracked this, which they haven't, would it really change the person's existential existence? The answer is no, it wouldn't. Next thing is, you didn't create life on this planet. Let's take it down from the universal right now to just this planet. Life on this planet, what is it, 15 million years old or whatever it is? I can't remember exactly, but we weren't there at the beginning of time when they say that human life or animal life or intelligent life began, right? So we weren't there at that point of origin either. So a lot of worrying about that period of time and what existed before it and how it happened and all that is really, again, useless, meaningless information from a psychological and existential point of view. The only beginning, the only origin, the only miracle that we were privy to is the fact that we ourselves individually were born, and that by being born we grew a thing called consciousness. We're able to think about ourselves, we're able to think about thought, and we're able to have this incredible facility. That origin we are in charge of. That origin we can study with this interior speculative ability, this rational ability. So that is where then many philosophers have said the main focus should be. These other things are of interest, of course, naturally, but they're not really of interest psychologically or existentially. Your existence, the fact that you came in with consciousness, and it's what you do with that consciousness, right? How you orient it. So thinking of itself is, again, meaningless. It's what you're thinking about, and it's how your thinking is focused. This is where the real answers will come from. In other words, what I'm saying again is that meaning comes from within. You give your life meaning. But what we do is we shut off that organic intelligence, or it is shut off for us, again, by the parents and what have you. And then we start to conform, or we start to let other people lead, or we want other people to inspire us. We're really exhausted when it comes to turning the inner senses on. Because, again, that will, again, lead us onto our own path. That breaks us away from the collective. That's why we're scared of it. We're so traumatized that we lean, and what we lean on is the mob. We lean on the collective. Many people have even said that our so-called ego is just not the I at all. That is just a construct of the collective.
Like the inner sense that you're talking about, do you believe that you can achieve like turning that back on through hallucinogenic drugs such as like ayahuasca or psilocybin mushrooms?
I can't say, because again, my statement would be presumptive on every individual's particular journey.
Some people can.
Um,
Some people can.
Exactly. So, I mean, goodness me, a man in a dungeon could do it when that will opens up within himself. So, absolutely, I can't sit there and make a pronouncement one way or the other, because remember, you're talking about the individual psychology. If a person with a toxic psyche, and who's basically self-murdered himself, goes and does one of these experiences, he may blow his brains out, he may blow his mind completely. Whereas another person who has a more healthy attitude, all of this breaks down to attitude, may go and have one of the most powerful experiences of life. Isn't it true that even David Icke started his sort of journey, or if not started his journey, went on to have these powerful experiences? So again, you know, it's really impossible for another person to dictate or to speak about it, you know?
Right on.
One way or the other.
Yeah.
What do you think life would look like today? What do you think our lives would look like today if we hadn't been lied to or manipulated, and this control hierarchy hadn't, hijacked the way we all live?
I've thought a lot about that, of course, and I think that also the philosopher Nietzsche, and to a certain degree Heidegger, were very much looking into that question. And of course they came up with it. The one thing that would have to be removed would be this incredible dependence on the mob, on the collective. They were both critics of the collective consciousness, because they said that the collective energy, and they're not really the only ones, Sigmund Freud and Jung and others have said this in their own language, but Freud, it was Nietzsche and Heidegger were the deepest, I think, and who sort of put language to this. And they basically were trying to say that, look, your ego, or that part of you that they call I, they didn't use psychological language. So, in fact, Heidegger didn't even use the word consciousness at all, because he didn't believe we were thinking at all. He said we still have to learn how to think. But in very brief summary, I think what they were saying is that because our sense of selfhood is an inauthentic selfhood, it's a pseudo-self, made up of just the approval rating, you know, this collectivism. For instance, let me give you an example. I can't remember who it was, but there was a famous scientist or some sort of psychologist who basically said that a child even learns that it is a separate entity from the simple act of it being looked at by a parent or by other people. When the child grows up, it has no sense in the early stages that it's an individual. It learns about that it is a self because it sees other people looking at it. And then it learns to look at other people in the same way. See, by being looked at, just the act of perception tells the child slowly, I am something that I must be being looked at. And then that develops slowly onto self-looking, like the subjective idea of being able to observe yourself. So in other words, the child wouldn't even have a subjective self, wouldn't even have a clue of its own existence without other people. The point being that there's a healthy need for collectivity, right? It's in the cues and affectations and exchange of body language and words and eye contact that even gives any one of us the feeling of selfhood. So what they're trying to say is if you didn't have other people, you wouldn't even have a self, and we couldn't even possibly conceive what that would be like. But then, of course, you can go too far, because the roots of your sense of self is other people and their existence. It becomes very easy, as we've already been dialoguing in your program here. It's only one step away before that becomes extremely chronic, isn't it? Because since people are the basis of our sense of self, my God, it's only the next step then to becoming completely absorbed in the collective for a sense of self. We may become even addicted to it. So then trying to go cold turkey and come off of that is a very elaborate and difficult process. And if anybody wanted to do it or try it, you know, again, it's not for me to say what would happen. Some people may be so traumatized by that. Say even if you tried some physical thing like removing yourself from people for 2 weeks or whatever, or even for extended periods of time. History is full of people who actually became hermits and all and completely distanced themselves. You know, again, I can't make any pro or negative statement, you know,
Right.
about whether that's a good thing or whatever. It depends on the personality of the individual, you know. So but say somebody did this just purely experimentally, you know, maybe they'd have a complete breakdown and there'd be no self there at all. They'd be just crawling around the floor like some sort of animal. But then, of course, even animals have a sense of self. They obviously do. And so moving on to say that then, okay, say you don't, and you try to do it gradually to decipher, say you stay within society and try to gradually determine what is unique about yourself and what makes you the same as everybody else. Way back in my own early first talks, even I addressed this. We know so much about what makes us the same as everybody else. I've said we have very little understanding of what makes us, unique. For instance, Michael. How many guys are called Michael in the world? I mean, it's ridiculous. So it's like, what is unique about us? The clothes we wear, the names we have, the food we eat, the ideas in our head, the language we use. We're speaking English or whatever. So, everything is shared. What actually then makes us unique? And is there anything at all? I mean, you're talking about the top philosophers in the world at the top of the totem pole haven't got an answer to that. They're still working on it to find out, is there anything that is actually really, truly unique about a person? Now, Heidegger and Nietzsche were, of course, implying that, yeah, there was. There is something that is authentic, unique about an individual, and their systems are there to try and show us how to attain that, And I guess that would also be somewhat what a lot of other famous teachers are trying to allude to. And then you have to know about those systems and come to your own conclusions about which one of these systems that they're talking about, which one of these means to the end, is a means to an end. That becomes a fascinating area of study, So my personal belief is that absolutely. I don't think we were born by accident. I think that all of these things that keep us away from a sense of selfhood can be removed. But it's not so much that they can be removed, it's the way that they're removed. If you remove it in the wrong, it's like, remember that, the $6 million man, Steve Austin?
Yeah.
He's trying to dismantle this bomb and he does it the wrong way, the whole country's going to blow up. So it's more like, it's like that. It's like the sweat is pouring down your face, because it's not about that can you remove it. It's that if you jiggle or you do it the wrong way, it's going to blow up in your face. So the philosophical process, you have one guy like Alexander coming with a freaking sword to cut through the Gordian knot. Maybe that's not quite the right way. That's a way for him, but it may not be the same way for everybody else. To approach consciousness the wrong way can make you insane. Somebody would argue that that's what happened to poor Nietzsche, and many other people that you could name. The lunatic asylums are filled of people who've actually seen the light. They know a hell of a lot, but they couldn't handle what they saw. So again, it's the way in which a lot of things are done is far more important than the what is being done. And that again, you can't really train somebody for. You can't. You can show a person how to use, like I say, a bow and arrow, right? But you can't change their perception. I mean, if they're half blind, there's nothing you can do. Even if you show them exactly how to put the string on the bow and put the arrow right and pull it back right and even stand right. But if they're blind and their eyesight is hopeless, there's no chance of them getting to hit that target. So you can show somebody a certain amount, 50%, but they have to bring their own unique skills and perception and acuity and brilliance to it. And then you have the miracle of life. So again, pointing out forever, like you said, Alan Watts, there's been a whole history of great teachers who have shown us what to do. Krishnamurti and you name it. Or like I said, these Nietzsches and Heideggers and all, but it doesn't necessarily mean that everyone's going to go and do it. They have to say, hey, this is what I've discovered. And then you got to say, yeah, well, let me try and do the experiment as well and see what comes with this. So I do believe that these dependencies are bad. I do believe that people have a pathology that can be healed and can be removed. But again, it's all about how you do it. What's your intention as to why you're doing it? As you know, a lot of people will want enlightenment for the wrong reasons. They may want it to have more power over people or whatever, or they may want to sit at the right hand of God or whatever it might be. So the reasons, the motives, may be the thing that they want might look good on paper. But do we really know the reasons why they want to do it? What's the motive behind it? Could be really, really negative.
We're all motivated by something.
Yeah. There's good motivations and bad motivations. I mean, I've always had a problem with, why would you want to be a guru? Why would you want to be a Sai Baba? Even if you have seen the light. You mean to tell me that you've gone and seen the light and then you're happy the fact with a bunch of completely clueless, auto-hypnotized millions sit in front of you on their knees looking up to you like God? I got a problem with that right away. But then I see a lot of other people don't. They think that's wonderful that he's there making all these miracles and enlightening everyone. So it's again, there's so many schools of thought. I can look at somebody and think that's a charlatan. That's a person, even if he has the light, why would he be using it this way? But another person might come along and go, no, it's a wonderful thing, all these repressed Americans and all, they can sit there and, this is wonderful. This is really going to help them become enlightened, You get more enlightenment out of watching Star Trek than sitting at some Indian guru's feet. I don't know. So it's all perception. It's all an individual's take on it. Some people want to escape themselves so much that they'll seek for the first, guy waving an incense stick and dressed in orange to sell their soul to. There's millions of ways to escape. working in a job from 9 to 5, looking for that success, tyranny, you may not put a gun to somebody's head and dress in military, gear with a bunch of medals on your chest. You may want to be the next, Nobel Prize winner or something like that. That's another power trip, you see. So it can be done under the pretext of doing charity or humanity for people. In psychology and philosophy, we always look into motives. You're not so fooled by the outward show of things, which so many people in our world today are completely bamboozled by, the outward show. They've got to think about the motives, the psychological motives. So the optimistic aspect of this does connect with the trauma period that you were alluding to earlier, because if you look at the chronology of that trauma, and again, I'm saying you don't even have to believe it had anything to do with the Nephilim, even if you just accept it was physical or whatever, planetary, whatever. It's such a short time ago that the optimistic attitude, when you study this matrix of power and control, is that, look, we may be actually healing from it. And you just can't force that healing any more than you can tell a guy who's been through a car wreck, and broken a couple of legs, to get up and walk right away. So this trauma that happened to all the human race. We're in a healing cycle. And so it's kind of really not too clever or rational to be utterly pessimistic, because these things do take time. And what I mean is centuries. So even though we maybe still see so much darkness and so much tyranny and so much control, and we lament it, and it's good to lament it, you're not meant to be happy about corruption. At the same time, it may be that the ego is gradually, imperceptibly healing in its own unique way. And that what is true and what is rich and what is real inside us never dies, can never perish. This was with the core of Nietzsche's teachings, that no matter how dark things get, he referred to it as the will to power. That will can never, ever die. It's eternal. So no matter how black things get and how oppressive things get, there will be no crushing of that light. So even if you're not a religious man, you're just coming out of a more humanistic school, even in that humanistic school, they claim that the spirit of man can't be crushed down forever, and it will come back, and always will. There's always a compensatory action in life, and one might say that the awakening that you're seeing today amongst ordinary people is part of that awakening. That lie just cannot persist forever, and that the people will find some instinctual or some very deeply a seed of wholeness within them that they will want to actualize. One can argue that is also the case.
Right. I've heard many people refer to this time as the Age of Enlightenment, Age of Awakening, in astrological terms, which I really have a hard time with the astrology part and really seeing how that could affect us, but it is funny to see that the internet came directly at the time that's considered a time of enlightenment, and if I were to write that thousands of years ago on paper, the internet would be the perfect incarnation of that coming to life. So I do see a similarity there and a coincidence.
Well, are you familiar with my theories on the inner zodiac?
The inner zodiac. I don't think I've heard the inner zodiac theories.
Yeah, because I agree with you that if you're looking at astrology from the wrong end of the binoculars, it doesn't make a bit of sense at all, and you're into something completely false. The origins of the zodiac are internal. The so-called external zodiac that people are studying is nothing more than a projection of consciousness. And I have that information on my Taroscopes website. There's articles and interviews and a video tour that I made that will explain the origins of the zodiac connecting to consciousness. In other words, the very same architecture of your consciousness, the very ability that you even have to know the difference between 1, 2, 3, 4, even the numbers 1 to 10, how you can tell that they have an order, that they run in this order, or that the 1 is different from 7. That same ability to learn language, like Noam Chomsky speaking about the incredible innate architecture of linguistics that a child has that enables that child to then go on and learn any language, whether it's any foreign language or English or Italian. How is it that children can do this when these linguistic skills are unbelievably complex? No computer could do it. He talks about that there are these innate, inbuilt categories of linguistics in the mind. So in exactly the same way as he's expressed that architecture, that mental architecture, so the principles of the zodiac, the mathematical underlying architecture, the 7, the 12, the 3, and the 4, and so on, that is in our psyche. And it's only because of the incredible misrepresentation of astrology by these so-called astrologers who haven't the faintest idea about the origins of their own subject matter. And it's also because of the egregious, backlashing or whatever you want to call it, criticism from the sort of materialist atheist crony, crowd who want to deny that there's any spiritual dimension to humankind. Astrology as a pure science has suffered a lot. But when you understand that it is based on a projection of human consciousness, then you'll start to understand more about what goes on. The zodiac, whether you're talking about the great ages, the more the processional ages, or you're talking about the yearly zodiac, these are just simply projections of human consciousness. So I always encourage my audience to, go and study up on that so they get more clear on when I even myself make, slip and talk about Uranus or Pluto or Venus or Sun. I always try to, caveat that by saying that, look, I don't actually mean some planet in space necessarily. I'm speaking about an archetypal force. Yeah, like a more of a spiritual, sort of a psycho physical force. It's just a means of communication, like music. The zodiac works on very similar principles as the way that musical notes communicate to us. I mean, there's a reason why people like to listen to Stairway to Heaven or a piece of Chopin. That stuff is speaking to us. Well, the zodiacal archetypes, any symbolism, in fact, whether it's alchemical, mathematical, color, for instance, the miracle of color, we could have 5 shows on just that. So we're being spoken to all the time. Remember, you were speaking earlier about you and the number 42 and how you were playing with that and wondering what the significance is. You see, that number, it's not the number that's the problem really there. It's what that number symbolizes in many ways. The factors that make it up, the relationship between this number 4 and the number 2. Because there's really 2 numbers there, right? You said 42, but that actually implies 2 numbers there, 4 and 2. And those numbers got a lot of different spiritual, esoteric relationships. But to cut it short, what I mean is that numbers, be it 1 to 10, they are themselves meaningless. Like I said, those are just things that exist. What exists behind them is frequency, energy. And those are archetypes. So the numbers are really messengers of a certain vibration. They're conveying a certain vibration. For instance, the number 4 basically conveys the vibration of order, structure, and practicality. So each number represents a particular frequency. That can be universalized, like in most numerology, we'd say those numbers go for everybody, and that's fine and dandy, but ultimately, each individual has a personal relationship with those numbers as well. When one would get into it and study it and come to their own relationship. Some people, for instance, I'll give you one example of the number 4, mandalas. When Carl Jung famously had these clients who went through, it wasn't even really major breakthroughs. It was almost like just the first stage of the breakthroughs that they had. Something led them to express themselves by painting mandalas. As you know, mandalas are made of 4, right? Mm-hmm. A lot of them are the square symbolism. And so what is that? Well, Nietzsche would have come along and said, well, I'll tell you what that is. That is a man's aesthetic response. Because man is primarily an aesthetic creature. Long before he uses his reason, long before he even becomes aware that there's a mathematical order to the universe, long before any of that left brain stuff, every man, including every child, is turned on initially by the simple beauty of what's around him. In fact, Nietzsche took this to the extent, anyone who wants to know Nietzsche has to understand that the aesthetic appreciation and aesthetic creations like music and art, actually going and doing it, writing poetry, this was the center of his philosophy, and many others have swore by this as well, that they claim that the whole meaning of life is based on this aesthetic appreciation. But without even getting into any of that, just the very fact that nature was so intoxicatingly beautiful to look at, even thunderstorms or lightning or the sunrise or whatever it might be, the miracle of the flow of river, a river and whatever, this made man wonder, wow, how did this all come into being? And so they saw that man's original state of consciousness was just this completely spontaneous response to beauty, right? And we still have it today. And in fact, I mean, we know this because you can look down through all of history, and all the people that we admire, including the Leonardo da Vinci's, were artists before they were geometrists or scientists. They were the greatest minds in the world, were often scientifically inclined, but they were also extremely artistic. I mean, half the buildings we live in, half the state buildings of the world, based on that Romanesque design, for instance, were designed not just by people who had brilliant mathematical skills and geometric skills, but were also incredibly inspired artistically, like Vitruvius and Pacioli and all of these other guys you see. Same thing in music. So yeah, music is mathematical to the extent that you got to know the notes and you got to know the writing aspect of music. But long before that, and even at the end of it, it's more about the beautiful aspect of it. You see, so half the stuff that we do in the world, or more of it, is motivated by this aesthetic sense. And therefore, that's important as well to bear in mind that we have this innately within ourselves. And when you're responding then to those numbers just represent, in geometrical form, they may represent some sort of geometry, or they may represent some sort of Archimedean geometry, like the Platonic solids and what have you. A lot of people, when they see numbers like 333 and 777 and 888 and 222, there's a lot of triad numbers appear for people. I think you mentioned even yourself earlier on 1111.
Yeah.
Was that you that mentioned that?
It is. It's a friend of mine. He's convinced that the coincidence of 1111, seeing it in not only in he sees like a double L in his last name and the last name of his girlfriend, and he sees symbolism in that being 1111.
Understood.
Addresses and times that things happen when he's thinking of certain things, and mile markers on driving on the highway.
Well, this is a language that when you're coming to it from this left brain point of view, it seems very strange, and a lot of people can think you're kind of crazy. But what's actually happening is that slowly the natural intelligence that we've been alluding to before, or if you want to say right brain or this aesthetic sense or whatever it might be, that's awakening. And we stop it. We get freaked out by it, and we stop doing it. And therefore, like right now on the clock as I'm looking, where I'm in Europe, it says 3:14. That's pi.
Right.
Yeah.
So now, how significant is pi? It's so significant. We just happen now to be talking about sacred geometry and numerology and the mystical aspects of a number, and I'm looking at the clock, and it's 3:14 exactly. The left brain goes, complete coincidence has no meaning. But who's to say to me it has no meaning? I decide whether it has meaning or not. You see, as we said earlier, it connects to that thing about bringing meaning out from yourself. So this natural organic flow, so these numbers, now say your friend went and started to discover about the Platonic solids, the dodecahedron, the cube octahedron, the tetrahedron, right? Mm-hmm. Which happen to be based on the cellular structure of the body, and there's so many other authors who have gone into this far more deeply than I've done, people like Drunvalo Melchizedek and even Greg Braden to a certain extent. There's many books out on this subject. You will start to find that the dimensions of these Platonic solids, there's 5 Platonic solids and 18 Archimedean solids, and those, by the way, are in the universe. Those just embody the very essence of the architecture of the universe, right? You will start to discover that these very numbers that you keep noticing, or some part of your brain is attracted to, turn out to be the numbers that are the numbers of these vertices and the numbers of the sides and the dimensions of these particular objects, these solids, or even the body human itself. The human body's dimensions itself from a Pythagorean Fibonacci point of view. And you have the Fibonacci series, you've got many other spiritual esoteric series that are inherent in the natural order. There's the ones that you know about, and there's the ones they don't want you to know about. So there's all of these spiritual numerology that's encoded into the Sphinx, that's encoded into the pyramid, that's encoded into the human body, and so forth and so on. There's so many books I could refer to people who are, if they're fascinated by this. I've gone into it at great length in my own work. And so these dimensions are those living archetypes. But the thing that those numbers are the bridge between you, right, your microcosmic understanding, your microcosmic intelligence, and the apparently external macrocosmic world. You're related to that. The world is made out of the same stuff as your consciousness is made out of. It's completely psychophysical, psychosomatic. And therefore those numbers, in one sense, are the language of the exchange of the energy between your psyche and the physical world. And we have moved only from a left brain point of view, where the only numbers we care about are the numbers of, money, and we've reduced it down to such a boring, banal level, 1, 2, 3, 4, like they're dead things. It no longer has an esoteric or spiritual component to it. Yet in ancient days, which we record in our minds, right, our consciousness is the culmination of millennia of experience. Well, that ancient ancestral voice, it knows what the number 2 or the number 3 or the number 22, number 44, whatever, represents. And we've shut that off, unfortunately. So it's very, very important in spiritual development to reopen it again.
Right. How do you suggest we do that, really? How do we open that back up?
Studying sacred geometry, studying numerology. My mystery school, the time gnosis, we have people working with these numbers on a very practical level, so that hopefully will be the starting ground for them to then go on to use double-digit numbers and so on and so forth. And getting into the tarot, all of the tarot cards have numbers, and they have deeply esoteric meanings. All the divination arts, that's extremely important to get involved with that if you're interested in what you're asking. Sacred geometry is part of it as well. And I would say even studying these solids, like I spoke about, the geometrical solids, the Archimedean, 18 Archimedean forms, and the 5 Platonic solids, and their dimensions and their vertices and the relationships between each other, like how many planes do they have, how many vertices do they have. This is what fascinated the ancients who built the pyramid. Half the ziggurats and pyramids are based on very precise geometry of 618, that's the phi ratio and what have you, and many other numbers I could mention, you see. The number 66 appears a lot. The Bible is loaded with it.
Do you think speaking of the pyramid, do you think the pyramids were built by, does your research show, have you found that the pyramids are built by human ancients alone?
I don't know. I think that, I'm not even sure they're dated right, and I can tell you that...
That's a Graham Hancock thing, is he thinks they're way older.
Yeah, I've always maintained that. I think they were built way back in the precessional age of Virgo, if not even before that. But as to who built them, I think enlightened humans, this Atlantean knowledge. Because remember, it's not only in Egypt that you have these precisely designed...
They're everywhere.
They're everywhere, including in Ireland as well. What did you say?
Some are even under the ocean.
Yes, the ones that Hancock has photographed, exactly. So there's no doubt in my mind that there was a gigantic school of knowledge. That's why people I refer to as the Arya or the Druids or whatever. These were a worldwide organization, and they're known in Egypt as the Shamsu Hor, or disciples of Horus. And they're the ones who actually built the pyramid. But the knowledge that they brought with them was Atlantean. It was from the ancient days when lots more things were known about the planet Earth than we can ever imagine. And also the consciousness of people was pre-trauma. So we're talking about people who had a very high level of consciousness here and knew how to move these blocks. Now there's even some, in the last 10 to 15 years, there's been some individuals who've even learned to move these stones. But 20 years ago, there wasn't even a crane that could have lifted them. Now they've made some small effort to even show that they could have been physically maneuvered, so we're slowly making progress to realize that, yeah, it probably could have been done just with what we would describe as human beings, without necessarily believing any supernatural or off-world presence. But again, I'm open to all things, because those sarcophagi, and I don't just mean the ones in the pyramid, but the ones in Saqqara in the south, the top engineers in the world with the latest equipment, the latest measuring equipment, cannot work out to this day how the angles of the inside of these boxes, like the king's coffer,
yeah,
and these other big giant, what they call sarcophagi, it's just nobody can work out how those angles are so precise. They don't even have the tools to do it today, let alone to cut them and get them so precise. And then the utter travesty, when they come to date it, they pick up a piece of broken pottery from beside it, date that pottery, right? There could be some, piss pot that some guy put there, some old shepherd. Date that, and then say, oh, well, now we know how old the sarcophagus was. That now passes for academic, sort of like, science or whatever. Yeah, this is what they hand to you on the plate for hundreds of years.
Wow. Now, as far as this knowledge of the planet that is obviously on a mass scale lost right now, do you think that the elite still hold this knowledge true? Because it seems like throughout history there's been a pattern of conquering a group,
burning all their records, destroying everything they have, building a school.
Well, two things about that is I don't believe the records were destroyed. All these libraries, I believe, were sequestered first. The ancient libraries, they say that Alexandria Library was burned down, like, about 4 times or something. Mm-hmm. But there's some very severe controversy about the final burning when Caesar was there. And in my eyes, the knowledge was taken, just in exactly the same way that history tells us that the Temple of Jerusalem, so-called, was plundered by Titus and all the gear was taken over to Rome. So there's no question about it that these Dragon Court, whether they be the Roman version or the Greek version or whatever, these people were plunderers. They knew where they were going. They knew about the antiquity, and they even knew about the sacredness of the stuff they were getting their hands on. So number one, I don't believe that it was burned. I believed it was sequestered, and they've had access to that through their private libraries. We all know about the famous Vatican Library, but that's only one of many, many, many private libraries all over the world that nobody would have a chance to get into, not even on a very high level, not even if you were a very senior academic. There's libraries that they just simply would not let you have access to unless you're an extremely high-level Freemason or, member of the Illuminati or what have you. Now and again, something leaks out here and there, but ultimately, all that'll leak out is that these things exist. What's in them never gets sort of revealed or what have you.
Yeah, it's funny that after thousands of years, no ruling member of the elite has ever just come forward with a smoking gun just out of guilt.
Because they have a lot to lose. Remember, it's a simple mafioso situation in which, first of all, most of them are ideologically completely in agreement with what's taking place. Secondly, they've got a lot to lose because once you go through their system, and I mean even just in a more sort of a humdrum, you went to their colleges, you joined their fraternities, you did well, and then you moved on and they put you in a nice position. You were the head of this or you were the head of that. They give you a bank to run or a country to run and all this kind of thing. Or a big shipping line or whatever. You don't really have, the power to sort of turn back. I mean, one of the things you got to understand about these guys is they sacrifice a hell of a lot to take that silver spoon. I mean, that has to be understood. There's really no way out. I mean, there's a movie called Brotherhood of the Bell that sort of lays this on the line and shows you how difficult it is. Because they'll ruin you. And if they don't ruin you first, they'll ruin your brother. His business will suddenly go bankrupt for some bizarre reason, or whatever. They will mess with people around you to give you the warning. And most of the highest level guys don't even need the warning because it's already inbuilt into their brain that if you ever think that you're going to, bite the hand that feeds you here, think again. Because they'll make you very aware of the fact that others have tried it and lost. So this minimizes it. It doesn't rule it out completely. Right. And it doesn't stop accidents from happening. For instance, during Perestroika, lots of files were left just stupidly. Big buildings full of precious, precious files were left unguarded. And so independent journalists were able to go in and grab all of the stuff. Same thing happened in Franco's during the Civil War in the Nazi, or the fascist leader Franco in Spain. An incident, for instance, will happen where the Allies came and bombed the whole of Barcelona, and bombs did strike the government buildings, and all the filing cabinets were blown open, right, and all the soldiers and everybody in the guards had scattered, leaving some very important journalists to run in and basically grab and hide all those precious, precious files, and then spent their life translating it. And because of that, we have authors that we know now amazing things about, the Jesuit connection to Franco, or we know something about the secret society Freemasonic connection that never would have come out any other way, you see. So there's flukes that happen. There is the occasional whistleblowing person, but it doesn't happen often, and it happens enough, I think, for people like myself and Yuri Lina and other people to go and gather that data. But certainly, yes, it's not as much as you'd want, no. But coming back to your original question, do they have the knowledge? Do they maintain that ancient knowledge? The answer is absolutely yes. We know that this is the case because the ley lines, the architecture, you only need to go back to the rise of the Templars in Britain. The Templars go a long way back, right back to the 9th century, 13th century, what have you. But even if you just deal with the 11th century of the original Templar families coming to England during the Battle of Hastings, the simple fact of their ability to position their houses, monasteries, and subsequently their churches and their state buildings on key areas of the geomantic grid
Right.
is just could not be coincidence.
Well, Washington is set up that way. If I'm not
Yes,
mistaken.
exactly. Same thing again over in America. In that situation, you find that just so much precision. And when you really get into it, and you find out how much they observed the movement of certain planets, individual planets, particularly Jupiter, but then stars like the movement of the star Sirius, for instance. The meticulous observation of any of this is obviously not dreamt up in 5 minutes. I mean, these things are very difficult. And remember, you have to sequester it, because you can't even let ordinary, clever laymen know about it. Not all laymen are stupid. Some of them are very intelligent, but they're not in on the game. So you have to have these fraternities. You have to have these secret fraternities to make sure that this knowledge isn't even then misused by what they would call muggers in the street, right? That's highly intelligent laymen who shouldn't know this. And we don't want those laymen also going out and teaching everybody else how to do it either. So remember, occult knowledge is occult because they want to keep it for themselves. They don't want you doing it.
Right.
They don't want you finding out about it. And so they've locked it down. That's why if you try and go and study anything that's more esoteric, well, you're not going to be able to. You have to pick that up on your own time. You're not going to be able to study it within college or university. In fact, you may put a target on your back by even mentioning that you're interested in these things.
Do you think that the symbolism that the elite use, obviously, I assume you would think there's some esoteric energy in that symbolism. Do you think that's what allows them to maintain the sphere of control over many years and over a global network?
Yeah, because remember, the sciences that they're using, these meta arts that they're using, are not negative in themselves. There's nothing evil about there's nothing evil about compasses and protractors and tarot cards and astrology, and any of the things that they're using in themselves are completely neutral. As a matter of fact, all the tools that they're using were once in the hands of, the world's greatest enlightened people, and were used for the good of all humanity. And more than that, the things that they're using, these sciences that they're using, are the sciences of the universe. They're the science. That's the science that holds the universe together. These alchemical principles, and these sacred geometrical principles, and these artistic, musical, and whatever else, color, how they manipulate color, how they manipulate light, those are all rules, laws, or whatever you want to call it, that are already there in the universe. These people are skewers. They are able to reconfigure that which is natural. Evil is nothing more than the subversion, right, of what is natural. They didn't create a thing. In fact, they are. That's the difference between magic and sorcery.
So when for example, when you see this symbolism come out in corporate logos, do you think they use that because it's just appealing to our subconscious?
I do. I think that's the reason, and that simply that they're putting their badge on it, just in the same way that if you created something, or you start a football team, you sit around a lot thinking about the logo and what it represents. You may base that logo on a hero of yours, or you may want to commemorate a famous figure, you see. So you think a lot about the reason why you create these logos. They do the same thing. If they're looking to commemorate not only the line, the bloodline, like for instance right now on the forum, under Empire of Death, I've got a logo from the City Guilds of London, tying into the whole royal oligarchic control of London, and therefore meaning the rest of the world. One of their organizations that they control is a network of guilds, network of universities called the Guilds, City Guilds. The symbol of that is a red lion, but the tail is a coiled serpent. I mean, anybody can go and look at it and agree with me that it looks like a blinking serpent, because it certainly doesn't look like a tail. Well, that tail is meant to indicate a serpent, because they're not really speaking about the lion, they're speaking about the dragon court. The serpent is the serpent brotherhood, right? So in that instance, that logo is just simply commemorating the line, not an individual, not a potentate from the line, just the line itself, a red lion, and that connects to, if you go to astrology, well, the red lion is Aldebaran, right? A star known as Aldebaran in Leo and what have you, on and on and on. That's why so many Templar inns, bars, pubs are called Red Lion, because they know what we don't know. But then, more broadly, they may want to commemorate a specific figure. And therefore, the logo will now actually be representing a person or some trait that they had, you know, or colors that they preferred or something out of their own coat of arms. There's all sorts of ways of doing this arrangement. It ties into even why somebody came along, they wanted to identify Obama, his facial features, and his presidency with Akhenaten. It's the same thing I'm telling you about. When you study this stuff, that's nothing remarkable there at all. To everyone else, it's remarkable. As a matter of fact, that's the
sun symbol was part of it.
Yeah. That's exactly. That's like, do me a favor. In fact, I've got it on the forum. If you take the symbol of his little round solar symbol with the 3 striations, and put it right next door to the Akhenaten symbol of the sun, and I've got it right there on the symbolism page in the forum. I mean, a complete imbecile can see that they're a designer take on the same thing. So this is what they do habitually. It's just the way they do things. We may only notice it once in our entire lives, and then go, wow, that's really weird. These guys are masters on it. I mean, you can't go to a state building. You can go to Christian churches and find the green man. You know, you can find the head of Mithras. You can find the head of Dionysus, and all sorts of paganism symbolism on Christian churches, on civic buildings, checkered floors galore. How many people walk across the checkered floor when they walk into a state building, or even for that matter, a university or college? How many of those people, I'm just asking a simple question, it's nothing to do with anything conspiratorial. How many people actually know that the checkered floor refers to the Knights Templars and the Cistercian order? Just simply that. No. Right. Very few. Not even the teachers who do it every day. So there you go. But yet they're in this university, meant to be learning things, meant to be educated, and couldn't tell you why the dimensions of a portal, you know, are that way, or you know, there's people going around with the name Tyler, or whatever, wouldn't even know where that word came from. They wouldn't even know what it means, that it's Masonic. You know, people going around calling, I'm called Stephen Cohen. What's the word Cohen mean? Well, I don't know. You know, so it's right there in plain sight. We're not talking, in one way we say, people like me are always talking about this is esoteric and that's esoteric. In one way, that's not even really true. A lot of it's so obvious, you know what I mean, that it's really not esoteric. It's right there in plain view, so it's a combination. And you can literally go back and take these dollar bill symbols and the symbols of Texaco or the symbols of Shell Corporation or I don't know what, AT&T, you name it, and you can find the exact duplicates way back in the time of Rome, way back in the time of Egypt, if it hasn't already been suppressed. That's only what we've got.
Right. And you mentioned the Green Man, which jarred a memory of mine. I saw a lot, like obviously a lot of the symbolism happens in Hollywood as well.
Yeah,
I've
exactly.
seen thing on Jim Carrey specifically embodying the Green Man in his movies, like The Mask. He wears a green mask. He also played the Grinch, which is a green character. There's a couple examples, and it just makes me wonder, like, well, I wouldn't think that is he in on that? Like, it just seems weird that you'd be able to find these coincidences and point out like 10, 12 different instances of symbolizing the Green Man for some actor. I don't know, like.
Well, just in the same way that you don't blame the merchant necessarily if his logo turns out to be some sort of Masonic thing.
Right.
You don't exonerate them either, but you don't necessarily implicate them until you're totally sure. Mm-hmm. You don't also implicate the actor necessarily if his smart-ass production people who are making these films are much smarter than him.
Right. So you think that, you know, if he were to be symbolizing the Green Man, that it's more producers, people behind the scenes that find these scripts to put them in, and what I just don't understand what the purpose is of creating that type of situation.
Well, that's because you have to study magic. You have to learn about sympathetic magic, these deep forms of hypnosis that are used. I've always tried to put it this way. First, let me answer your question about the actor dynamic. The art directors are the ones who do it all. The art directors work with the producers, not the producer, but the directors. They often are coming from a deeply, a great interest, sometimes healthy, sometimes not, interest in symbolism. Then you have a lot of these directors, because believe me, it's not easy to make movies. It takes millions. You have to be really in with the establishment. So, for instance, a particular person like Stanley Kubrick, for instance, their work is layered with esoteric meaning because either they have an interest in it as a layman, or they are actually members of esoteric societies and are just front men for those Masonic societies. So when you go frame by frame and start looking at the esoteric symbolism in, say, something like Eyes Wide Shut, or even a Spielberg piece of garbage, like oh my God, Back to the Future or whatever this nonsense, and then you start.
Encounters apparently had a lot of it.
Exactly, and there's so many other, even now these latest movies, Immortal, it's all this Nephilim symbolism and what have you. So yeah, when you go frame by frame, you start noticing all this obviously esoteric stuff. That's because these people are themselves just frontmen, messengers, so to speak, mercurial messengers for these secret societies who want to put out this esoteric information, but they have learned from a long time back to do it in this play of masks, okay? Now, that doesn't mean that the guy who's trying to earn a living at the end, often they're completely ignorant. I mean, I've even tracked some of these films when the actor is being interviewed about some of the symbolism, I mean, they're totally idiotic. They don't have a clue. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. All I can say is that, yeah, there's a humongous difference between the level of intelligence of a Peter Weir, who would make the Truman Show, and the actor, right, who, if you ask him later on after the movie's made, so what do you think that meant when you went through a door in the sky? Well, gee, I don't really know,
Yeah,
so
I got paid.
Exactly. They're like performing seals. Later on, they may become a little bit more knowledgeable, and certainly if they want to go on and direct anything, they're going to have to start getting into it. And believe me, I'm the first to say that I'm skeptical about all of these people, actors included. I mean, I am really skeptical about them all. I do believe there's one big giant cabal there in Hollywood, that a lot of these guys are in the know. I'm very unforgiving with them, but at the same time, one has to always say, take each individual case as it goes. But then getting on to the more deeper question of the esoteric stuff, is I sum it up like this. One of the most important things to always remember when you're dealing with the multimedia here, and especially the people who create video games and all of this media, visual media, is that we would be in a dire strait, psychotic state if they weren't able to drip feed us some of the archetypal symbolism that they've also raped us of by the other hand. In order to get the slave to be the slave, you had to rape him through his life, through centuries of time, on this archetypal level. You've got to put, 50-foot steel doors between him and his true self, or you have to shut down the right brain. There's many ways of languaging this. You have to shut down his aesthetic appreciation, like we talked about Nietzsche saying you have to open it up again. But what they have discovered, to their horror, is that if you do that, then you basically have a psychotic creature on your hands. Now, they don't mind that to a degree, but the psychotic has still got to get into his car every day and go down there and push the wheel. He's still got to breed a new generation of slaves, and whatever else, you see, to run the entire planet. So they only want a certain neurotic individual so fucked up that he won't be able to do his inner homework to find his spiritual core. But he shouldn't be so crazed out, so lost, that he can't perform his duties for Big Brother. So what they do then is they send you down to the cinema, or they put these, because they know that the food of the mind must be symbolic. You're missing this whole archive inside yourself that they have suppressed. They've raped whole nations, man. I'm talking about the wholesale rape of entire groups of people, not just the Druids, but many other powerful Gnostic spiritual groups who used to teach people this, who very much were using symbolism, who were trying to awaken this aesthetic sense, or had it awakened. So we have had centuries of purgation, so that your modern man is utterly vagrant, utterly cut off from these symbolic roots. I mean, Carl Jung went blue in the face talking about this. And so they've realized that that has made man very weak. So by creating this aesthetic movement and putting in it so many deep, archetypal, ancient, look at the movie The Fountain. Look how much the Tree of Life, I'm obsessed with this concept.
To watch that. That was a weird movie.
Remember that? And then
we tried watching that, and that movie was just so odd.
Yeah, a very, very, very bizarre movie. Now, one of the central themes in it is this Tree of Life. I mean, I'm obsessed with that. I've got a whole thing coming out on that. I've got a whole appendices on it. And there it is in this movie. It takes central place, not just in this movie, but the religious symbolism of the Tree of Life goes back unbelievably many thousands of years. You can find it in the earliest Babylonian symbolism. It's right there in the book of Genesis. And here it is as a central character, in this modern film, with all this archetypal symbolism around it. So the people who do this, they know that they have to, every now and again, give you that I think a good parallel would be, isn't it, that when you're a drug addict, like a heroin addict, and if you declare that you are, you can get free needles and they like inject you with some of the heroin or something? Is that what they do?
I don't know, Dave.
That they don't do that in the States, but they do that in some parts of the world. Yeah.
Right. Well, they give
Yeah,
you a little.
they give in the States, they give heroin addicts methadone.
Well, that's what they're basically doing with this. For me, when you see this, they're reinvigorating you, like putting the metaphor of drugs or the metaphor of when you're falling into a complete state of sleep. They give you those. They put that sulfur in front of your nose, and you wake up sort of again.
Yeah, smelling sulfur.
So yeah, exactly. That's what it is. It's reminding you. It's emboldening you. Not enough for you to really get aware again. Although, believe me, some people do get very inspired by this. But on the whole, it's just, get out your popcorn, go and watch something here, fascinating, Star Wars, whatever, good versus evil, or all the things we know that these movies contain. Throw in a bunch of great symbolism, alchemy, like the end of Star Trek 1, where there's this amazing meeting of man and woman together, where they transcend and go in to become one, so there we have a concept I hope your audience is familiar with, androgyny. It turns up endlessly in movies. Very ancient, very powerful, ancient alchemical motif that is embedded in the unconscious. So at the end of that movie, they have this amazing scene where the male and the female literally blend together. You have exactly the same type of scene at the end of Dracula, Bram Stoker's Dracula, where when she cuts off the head of the count, he dies, and then she kills herself, and there's some sort of spiritual nucleation of the male and female, and then the last thing you see is this angelic, androgynous ascent, like a transfiguration taking place, you see. And you have it over and over and over again in various films, this concept of androgyny. And, I try to go list these motifs that they're using all the time. The Tree of Life, the red-headed woman, the red-dressed woman, the woman in the red dress, or whatever it might be, the checkered floor, you name it. These are there because they need to keep you somewhat archetypally, I'm looking for the word like nutrients, or it's nourished.
Right. Gotcha.
To an extent, just so that you're not so malnutrited that you can't function, That's what it is. But it certainly isn't so that the whole world, they're itching to enlighten the world. Maybe you get that through another kind of movie like V for Vendetta. There are certain movies that do fall into the category. I'm not.
Matrix, V for Vendetta.
Yeah. I'm not, and even the Truman Show. I'm certainly saying that those are movies that are highly artistic, designed to awaken the aesthetic sense, certainly designed to turn you on to some greater, more metaphysical motifs. There's no doubt in my mind that's the fact. But there are a lot of other movies as well that are doing the opposite. They're sorcery. They're there to inspire. They're an agenda from what's called the Dionysian cult, or the group that and you mentioned earlier that you watched My Age of Manipulation, so you know that I went into this in great detail, not to mention the more sordid satanic cults that are involved, but just in general this cult of Dionysus, whose job it is to put solar cult, androgynous celebs in front of us, the Mick Jaggers, David Bowies, who else? Jim Morrison, that kind of thing, yeah. And the even more ridiculous versions today. That's another version, again, to keep an iconic. These men, solar children, represent Mithras. They actually represent the very gods that these Illuminati adore. And when I mean adore, I mean worship. I mean really worship these guys. So they will make a little myth. They'll create a hero, like an Elvis or whoever, and that being will jump through the hoops in the very same way that you were speaking of Jim Carrey doing, will live out in his movies or his music or in some other even scenario, will live out the life drama of one of these potentates that they actually worship. Like literally live out the life of Horus, or live out of course it'll be in symbolic form.
Sun symbolism in the case of Elvis, right?
There you go. Right. Absolutely. And again, some of it happens autonomously, and the rest of it is very contrived. I'd say that now it's almost entirely contrived. But remember, even if it wasn't contrived, this happens. Myths happen. So they've noticed this. They've noticed that in ancient times it happened automatically, and now all they do is they just make a sort of a simulacra, a simulated version, so that all the girls or whatever will identify with it or whatever, and the fashions will start up, and then whatever it might be. They know that the certain kind of psyche that is more eclectic, that's more synthetic, that's more right brain, put these heroes in front of the media, in the commercials, in the Levi ads, and you name it, all in the magazines, and that will do the trick. And people will not have a faintest idea of what is being communicated by way of these advertisements for jeans or whatever it might be. You know, it's just unbelievable when you get into it. And if you've seen My Age of Manipulation, you'll know that it's like such, I think you said earlier yourself, it's such a huge field. How can any one DVD or presentation cover it? One of my biggest problems is people always emailing me going, oh, yeah, I wish you'd have talked more about that. And here's me, yeah, I wish I could have done. But, you know, I mean, there's only so many hours I can, even I can stand up on a stage, but without dropping. You know, it's just so lengthy. It's so in-depth. And then again, I can't do it all. My point is to make a lot of, suggestions and show people the way. But, really they got to go up and do it themselves. I provided the information. I provided the sources. People need to get into it and really understand how this works for two reasons. One is to take the power away from the sorcerer, and two is to use it yourself for positive reasons.
I had a question for you. It's kind of maybe a little bit of a personal question. I see a lot of similarities in electronic dance music today and like ancient tribal sounds, and I was just wondering, do you personally listen to electronic music?
Yeah, I like trance music a lot. I like the Orb and the Future Sounds of London, and
Yes.
and even Tangerine Dream, and a certain amount of like a Vangelis, and even what's his name? Oh, there's so many.
Yeah. Oh, I'm a big fan of trance music and like a lot more psychedelic, like the harder, you know what I'm saying, like almost like an infected mushroom.
Yeah, and electronic. I like industrial. I like industrial music. Sure, I like it. In fact, I like any music that has that mantric rhythmic stuff. Whether it's in a more industrial metal type of thing or even more trance music. I adore that kind of music a lot. I listen.
More symphonic. Well, I'm a musician. That's why I wanted to ask that question, because I heard the song that you played during the Free Your Mind with the symbolism, and you had the different pictures, and one was going into another, and you can see the correlations through all these symbols, and that's what sparked my question.
Yeah, I try to put as much of that music into my own documentaries as possible because I listen to it a lot, and it's very right brain, it's very stream of consciousness, and it's music that allows you to dive in, where you're more personally involved. It's not linear, and it's not a song necessarily with lyrics or a structured, sort of 3-minute song or whatever. So it allows you to go in there, and why I like it a lot is because I work so hard that if I play just 3-minute songs,
yeah,
you go stir crazy listening, even songs you really like.
Yeah.
Whereas if you put on the trance music, it's different every time. Every time you put that same piece on, you're hearing more in it, and it doesn't become as boring.
Yeah, of course. Like you hear the different layerings of the different sounds, and how
always
they
hearing
come
different
together.
For instance, when I used to do retail, when working in bookstores and what have you, we'd always try to slip the trance music on when the boss was out, because then your day goes by faster. Because if you're listening to these very formulaic kinds of music, it becomes very monotonous, and you almost feel more tense.
Yeah. That's
No.
awesome.
Well, hey, we've pretty much almost taken up 2 hours of your time, but it's been great, eye-opening, very inspiring. One other quick question I had easy to answer is, excluding your own work, just for the sake of the question, what would you say, if you had to narrow it down, would be the 3 most important books that someone could read?
Well, certainly top of the list would be, in my eyes, I'd say that Dr. John Coleman. Any of his work is highly recommended. A book by Webster Tarpley and Lyndon LaRouche crowd called Dope Incorporated, because it specifically shows you the British connections of how America is run by the British oligarchy. That is a piece that is so important to know about. It not only takes you back to the time of the Constitution, what have you, but it also explains what's going on in today's world, who these presidents are, how they come to power, the kind of treachery. It also explains where these federal orgs come about and the world control from an American point of view. And why I say this is because Americans are usually quite well up to speed on that there is a conspiracy. They beat the world knowing that there's a conspiracy, but many of them have not made the transition yet to know how the British aristocracy factor in. They think they're free and the British has got nothing to do with it. It's extremely important that they read Dr. John Coleman and Dope Incorporated from people like Webster Tarpley, Those are highly recommended. And then satellite to that is, of course, then the G. Edward Griffin, who do speak about the same thing, and Eustace Mullins, that kind of thing. And those are crucial. There's so many others I could mention and have listed. If people go to my articles and look at the Constitution Con article or look at the Weapons of Mass Destruction Found article, go to the bottom and you'll find all these authors that I list. But since you asked me that question right now, those are the ones I can think of. A guy called, he wrote the book Treason in America, Anthony Chaikin. An incredibly important book there. You know, so there's because you are speaking just about the conspiracy aspect, right?
Well, yeah. I mean, well, just in your opinion, since you have such a much more broad understanding of all the material, be it symbolism, be it control, or even just historical hidden knowledge. If someone was really looking to dive in, where's a good jumping off point? I'm sure all those books are a great jumping off points.
I would recommend my own work because I've tried to synthesize just for that very reason.
Right. That's why I love your work, because you do that, and you also, you give your sources all the time, every time, and you, even in this talk alone, in this 2-hour talk, I'm going to have to go back. I've probably got 1,000 hours of material now to go and research just based on all the references to other work, which I think is great. I don't have that type of memory to be able to do that.
Well, I just do it all the time. I don't really have a good memory either, but the thing is I just do it all the time. But you see, then if you say somebody was wanting to study the symbolism thing, I'd have a whole bunch of different authors for them. Say they were interested in the history of Christianity, the Templars, I have gone through all of this subject matter all my life and been able to synthesize the best of the best. I mean, actually by reading it. So, I read maybe 20 books a month, and therefore, over the years, just by the simple act of doing that, you find out who is just utterly worthless or only half good, and who's absolutely bloody marvelous. So say I was talking about Egypt, or or the Bible, then I got my Tony Bushbys and my Ralph Ellis's and Mustafa Gadalas and Ahmed Osman's. So it depends from which school you're coming. If you're talking more on the psychological aspect, then you have different people to recommend and all of this. Symbolism, of course, is very, very important. So you have different people to recommend there. Judaism, the history of Judaism. I can save people, centuries there, by recommending things that they should read. So it's about eclectically having your fingers on the pulse of all of this different subject matter, because I'm not a narrow guy. I don't get only fanatical about one area and beat that to death, because then you become sort of partisan, then you become sort of obsessed. And by the moment that you do that, you're missing other key information over here that you may not be interested in. And this is also what's happening a lot in this movement. Like, for instance, you barely see anyone in this revisionist movement ever talking about philosophy or psychology, and very few ever talking about catastrophism. And they should be, and it would help their work to do so. When I first came into the movement, nobody was even speaking about Ireland and the incredible reservoir of knowledge that you get from studying the Irish Celts, not the Celts, but the Irish and then the Celts and so on. So there's, as I say, it's because it's partly early days yet, and half the greatest books on any of these subjects have only come out within a very short period of time. Remember I was saying about the healing and that we were in a short, early period of time? That's also corroborated by the fact that some of the greatest discoveries have only been made in about the last 20, 30 years. And even some people could argue within 20 years. Some of the great authors I would mention, their books have only been out, including my own, within a very, very short period of time. So again, even though there's been great champions before, it's only now, especially in the field of Judaism, for instance. Right now we have many Jews themselves blowing the whistle on the lie of Israel and on the lie of the Israelites. Jewish men, people I can mention and have mentioned. Actually, Jewish authors themselves, like Shlomo Sand and others, who are coming out from within these organizations and showing you, it's built on lies, it's built on mind control. There isn't any science to back it up, and the science that's been handed to you is bogus science. It's all propaganda, There's a huge propaganda machinery at loose in the world. So the one thing I will say is that, I do in fact read the books. I just don't read like a comment or two on some Amazon website or whatever. I really buy the books, I read them, I study them meticulously, and try to then summarize the best parts of the book. So if people go to my astrotheology site or the Irish Origin site and go to those appendices areas, they will see very detailed summaries of some great books, you know, that would cost a lot for people to buy and a hell of a lot of time to read. And even if you did read it, you might not even be able to, you know, summarize or realize why this book is important. I've done that work myself for people to go on my websites and check it out. And on a little bit lesser level on the forum, I try to do the same thing, you know. But that certainly does mean that I do have my favorite authors. There's some pretty standard authors that are absolutely crucial. I mean, absolutely crucial to know about.
I'm excited to go and check it all out. I mean, I've checked out obviously in this week since talking to you. I've been just hitting your material as hard as possible because, I mean, I asked you after watching Architects of Control, and I was shocked that you were, you know, willing to come on the show and talk to us about this stuff, and it's great. I appreciate it immensely. But I guess to wrap it up and let you carry on with your day, just to wrap it up, like, what are you working on right now?
Lots of things. As I said, the Tree of Life, I'm trying to get that together. We're revising all of my 3 books, doing just a normal update on those, and various DVD projects, slowly working on those. I mean, a lot of online stuff. So it's unbelievable, you know, it's not a moment there's not even a moment to blink, you know, it's just such a busy time right now.
Well, I really appreciate you coming on and doing this because this was very educational for me. So I just wanted to say thank you.
Well, thank you, and we'll certainly, you know, if you're up to it, we'll do it again. There's a lot of other areas to go into, you know, so I'd be happy to. It's always a pleasure for me, you see, to speak with people who actually know things and have good questions about it, as opposed to hosts who really don't have a clue, you know, and haven't got the right motives, you know. It appears to people that I do a lot of interviews, and in fact, I actually do not do a lot of conferences or interviews for the very purpose of, you know, that the people just don't have integrity or they're out for themselves or what it might be. So, you know, I'm always glad to come on when there is knowledge there and there's the eagerness. So, you know, thank you for giving me that time as well.
Of course, yeah. I mean, I'm obviously a layman. We're both laymen, but, you know, we have an incredible interest, and, I mean, I feel fulfilled. Hey.
Of course.
Well, see, I'm also a layman. I always maintain and say clearly that I am no expert on any of these things. The jury is always out. I could be wrong in everything. We're all in in fact, so much of my work is collaborative. People send me stuff on a daily basis, sometimes, you know, hundreds and hundreds of things a week. That's one thing. And secondly, I'm always keeping an open mind. I always think that, yeah, what I've seen and what I've learned, you know, of course, you proceed by assuming that you're right. Otherwise, you couldn't move out of bed in the morning. But you always keep the intellectual openness to realize that not only could you be completely wrong, but you need to always you always need to be actively thinking about the opposite position that you're taking. And I do that a lot. And I think a lot of people do not do this. They become obsessed, you know, but I don't. I'm very strong when I advocate what I believe to be the case. But I always personally keep an open mind to say, yeah, well, maybe that's completely the opposite. In fact, what is the opposite? Let me study that. And then, as I said, by going through all of these different books that come out, I'm also very aware of all the disinformation. I'm also very aware that if you don't do what I do and you don't help people go to the right sources, they're going to probably be swamped with all of this disinformation, because now that the Big Brother has understood that there's a gigantic movement throughout the world looking for this truth and digging deeply, they have unleashed their own robots through the publishing orgs to write books that apparently are also revelatory